There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to the generous. It is not the loneliness of poverty, nor the loneliness of isolation. It is the loneliness of a man who has given everything and looked around one day to find that the room is full of people who have never once asked how he is. Theodore Emmanuel Ashford, called Theo by those who loved him, though that number was smaller than anyone in his company would have admitted, woke each morning in a bed that was slightly too large, in a room that was slightly too quiet, in a house that was full of life in every corridor except his own. He was not a handsome man. He had known this since the age of 9, when a girl named Patricia had told him plainly at a birthday party that he had a face like a shoe. He had laughed. He had always laughed. His nose was slightly too broad, his jaw slightly too soft, his eyes set perhaps a fraction too close together. He wore glasses, wire-rimmed, perpetually smudged, because he was forever touching the lenses with the side of his finger, a habit he could not break. He was not tall. He was not athletic. He was, in the plainest terms, an ordinary-looking man who happened to be worth $460 million. Ashford Manor sat on 47 acres in the rolling hills an hour outside the city, and it was a place of genuine beauty. 3 stories of pale stone and high windows, ivy trained along the east wing, a fountain in the circular drive that had not worked in 3 years because Theodore kept forgetting to call the repairman, and then feeling too guilty about the cost of the repairman to actually summon him. This from a man who had bought the fountain for $900,000 on a Thursday afternoon, simply because it had reminded him of a fountain he had once seen in a photograph of Rome. He had never been to Rome. He kept meaning to go. Inside the manor there lived, at last count, 14 people who were employed by Theodore Ashford in various capacities. Mrs. Edna Briggs, his cook, who had come to work for him 17 years ago when her husband left her with 3 children and a mortgage, and Theodore had seen her advertisement in a local paper and hired her within the hour, though he was 23 at the time and had no idea what to do with a cook. Mr. Joseph Crane, the groundskeeper, who had come the following year and who tended the gardens with the fierce, silent pride of a man who has found his purpose. There was Amara, who managed the household linens and the cleaning schedules, and who had once been a teacher in her home country before the school where she worked had been burned down, and Theodore had sponsored her immigration, and then found that he had no idea what to do with her either, and so she had become invaluable. There was old Mr. Harris, who drove the cars and had a tremor in his left hand, and who should have retired 5 years ago, but whom Theodore could not bring himself to let go because Mr. Harris lit up like a lantern whenever he sat behind the wheel. There were others. A young man named Felix who helped with grocery orders and was studying for a degree in accounting and was given every Tuesday afternoon off to attend his classes. A woman named Rosario who did the ironing and who brought her 2 daughters on weekends because their school was closed and she could not afford childcare. A pair of brothers, Samuel and George, who were supposed to maintain the electrical systems, but spent most of their time arguing with each other about football in the kitchen, while Mrs. Briggs pretended to be annoyed by them. And there was Marcus Hale. Marcus was Theodore's assistant, his executive right hand, the man who organized his calendar and answered the calls he did not want to answer and translated his instincts into action across the 3 holding companies, the investment portfolio, the charitable foundation, and the 17 other ventures that had sprung up over the years from the original tech company Theodore had built in his late 20s with a borrowed laptop and a refusal to sleep. Marcus was 42, 3 years younger than Theodore, and he was everything Theodore was not, tall, well-built, with the kind of face that women turned to look at twice. He dressed expensively in a way that seemed effortless. He laughed easily and loudly, and people gravitated toward him like planets toward a sun. He was Theodore's best friend, or so Theodore believed with his whole heart. Theodore had known Marcus since university, where they had roomed together in a dormitory that smelled of old carpet and ambition. Marcus had been studying business, perpetually behind on his assignments, perpetually charming his professors into extensions. Theodore had been studying computer science and had written Marcus's final-year strategic management paper for him in exchange for nothing. He had simply done it because Marcus had asked and Theodore had not yet learned to say the word no. He had still not entirely learned. But what Theodore had, and what Marcus and all the others often failed to see, was the quality of his mind when applied to things that mattered. He saw people with an almost frightening clarity. He saw their needs before they could articulate them, saw their grief beneath their smiling, saw the architecture of what they were trying to become. It was this quality that had made him rich, not luck, not ruthlessness, but a profound and aching attentiveness to what the world needed and how to build it. He simply could not turn that attentiveness off, could not restrict it to business, could not stop himself from seeing the lonely and the struggling and the desperate and wanting with his whole being to help. It was as his therapist had once told him, before Theodore had quietly stopped going to therapy because the therapist's office was in a building that had no wheelchair access, and he felt guilty about the inconvenience to others, both his greatest gift and the mechanism by which he was most reliably destroyed. On a Tuesday morning in late September, Theodore sat at the long oak table in his study, a room so full of books they had begun to colonize the floor in organized stacks, and reviewed the week's schedule that Marcus had sent over. Board meeting on Wednesday. Dinner with the Foundation trustees on Thursday. A call with his lawyers on Friday regarding the Barlow acquisition. And on Saturday, he paused here, the harvest gala that Mrs. Briggs had been planning for 3 months, and that was primarily an excuse for all the staff's extended families to descend on the property and eat Mrs. Briggs's food and dance on the south lawn. Theodore loved the harvest gala. He was not a man who danced. He had the rhythm of a startled ox. But he loved the way the lanterns looked strung between the old oaks, and he loved watching Mrs. Briggs's grandchildren run across the grass, and he loved the hours when no one was asking anything of him, and he could simply stand at the edge of the light and watch his people be happy. He was reading the schedule for the 3rd time, because he often read things 3 times, when the door opened and a small person ran into the room and crashed directly into his leg. Theodore looked down. Elliot looked up. The boy was 5 years old, with large dark eyes and ears that were still slightly too big for his head, and a gap between his 2 front teeth that Theodore found so charming he had refused, against every piece of pediatric dental advice, to feel anxious about. He was wearing a dinosaur shirt and 1 shoe, and he was holding, for reasons Theodore did not immediately pursue, a single carrot. Elliot considered this. He climbed into the chair beside Theodore without being asked, which was his habit, and arranged himself with his legs dangling and his carrot held in his lap like a scepter. He looked at the papers on the desk with the focused incomprehension of a scientist examining data in an unfamiliar discipline. Elliot looked at his single-shod foot with fresh concern. Theodore took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, a gesture that accomplished nothing optically, but that he performed whenever he was feeling something he was not ready to name. He looked at his son. There was not a cell in Theodore's body, not a nerve, not a molecule, that did not understand that this child was his. Not biologically, Theodore was perfectly clear on biology, but in the way that mattered, the way that could not be registered in any document or proven in any court, but that existed as an absolute fact of the universe. He had first held Elliot in a hospital corridor in the small hours of a February morning, when the boy was 11 minutes old and wrapped in a standard-issue hospital blanket, and something in Theodore's chest had shifted with the slow, irreversible grinding of a tectonic plate. He had not planned to adopt a child. He had not planned much of anything in his personal life, which had proceeded in a series of poorly managed accidents punctuated by good intentions. But Elliot had come through a connection with the Foundation, a young woman in crisis who had known, with the animal certainty of a person in extremis, that she could not raise him alone, and who had chosen Theodore after a meeting in which he had listened to her for 2 hours without once checking his phone, and had then quietly arranged for her to have housing and health care and a job training program for when she felt ready. She had signed the papers and disappeared into the city, and Theodore had brought his son home. It was the best thing he had ever done. He knew this the way he knew very few things, without qualification, without doubt, without even the shadow of a second thought. Theodore looked at the carrot. He accepted it. He took a solemn bite. Elliot nodded, satisfied, and slid off the chair and ran back toward the kitchen, trailing his missing shoe's absence behind him like a flag. Theodore sat alone in the quiet. He finished the carrot. He put his glasses back on. And he returned to the schedule, which had not changed, but which seemed to him, in the aftermath of Elliot, like a significantly smaller thing than it had before. Chapter 2. Marcus. Marcus Hale arrived at the manor on Thursday mornings as a rule, driving the silver car he had convinced Theodore to lend him 3 years ago, and which he had never returned. Theodore had never asked for it back. He arrived this particular Thursday with a leather folder under one arm and the air of a man who has slept well and exercised and had a complicated coffee from an establishment that understood the difference between foam and froth. He walked through the manor's front hall with the easy authority of someone who had long ago decided he belonged here, past Amara, who greeted him without warmth, past young Felix, who greeted him with too much, and into Theodore's study where he dropped the leather folder on the desk and said, without preamble, "Theodore signed the 40 things." He always signed the 40 things. Marcus sat across from him, loose-limbed and confident, watching him work through the stack with the appreciative tolerance of a man who knows that the engine running the machine is not himself, but is content with his position beside it. They had developed, over 20 years, a rhythm that required very little speech. Theodore would process a document, pause occasionally to ask a question, and Marcus would answer from memory, or look something up on his phone with the practiced speed of someone who had learned that Theodore's questions, when they came, were precise and would require precise answers. It was comfortable. It was familiar. It was, Theodore would have told you, the longest sustained relationship of his adult life. He would have been wrong, technically, because Mrs. Briggs had been with him for 17 years and Marcus for 14. But Mrs. Briggs was family in a category that transcended arithmetic, and Marcus was something he struggled to name. Not family. Not exactly. The closest approximation he had arrived at was, Marcus was the person who knew everything about Theodore's life and was still here. This was, Theodore understood, not a neutral standard. It was the standard of a man who had been left, in various ways, by most of the people he had allowed himself to need. Theodore looked up. Marcus listed names. Theodore listened. He was not particularly interested in the Hartley media assets, though he acknowledged their value. What he was doing with the quiet, habitual attentiveness he brought to all such social inventories was cataloging who would be in the room and why, and what each of them needed and whether he could give it, and whether it would cost him something he couldn't afford. Marcus made a note. Then he leaned back in his chair with the particular quality of ease that Theodore had always associated with him, a ease that, if Theodore had been paying a different kind of attention, he might have noticed was not quite as relaxed as it appeared. A performance of ease. A man who was comfortable only when he was also calculating. But Theodore was not paying that kind of attention. He was thinking about the Barlow counteroffer, and about Saturday's gala, and about whether Elliot had found his shoe. Theodore looked up again. Marcus smiled. It was a good smile, the kind that had opened many doors. That she's remarkable. Her name is Celeste. He said the name as though it were the opening line of a story he had already written the ending of. Theodore did not notice this. He was a man who noticed the grief beneath smiling, the need beneath confidence, the loneliness beneath laughter, but he had one catastrophic blind spot, one area where his attentiveness failed completely. He could not see it when the person performing was someone he trusted. He never saw it coming from inside the room. Chapter 3, Celeste. The Caldwell Foundation dinner was held in the ballroom of a hotel that had been built in the 1920s and had carefully preserved the best and worst qualities of that era. The high ceilings and the gilded moldings and the sense of occasion, but also the drafts and the inadequate lighting and the coat room that was never quite large enough. Theodore arrived in a car that Mr. Harris drove with both hands and both knees pointing outward from the wheel, which was Mr. Harris's style, and which Theodore had long ago decided to simply never look at. He wore a suit that had been fitted for him by a tailor Marcus had recommended, and that fit him well. Suits were one of the few areas in which Theodore consistently made the correct investments, having learned early that the world would form its initial assessment of him before he opened his mouth, and that there was very little he could do about his face, but he could, at least, wear a good suit. The room was full of the kind of people who attended this kind of dinner, wealthy, well-connected, performing their civic generosity with the practiced grace of professionals. Theodore moved through the room the way he always moved through rooms, steadily, quietly, with a quality of attention that occasionally startled people who were accustomed to being looked past. He was talking to the Caldwell Foundation's director about the water access project in the northern provinces when he became aware, in his peripheral vision, of a change in the room's energy. It was not a dramatic change. It was the kind of subtle reorientation that happens when something beautiful enters a space, a slight turning of heads, a fractional brightening, the invisible tuning of the collective attention toward a new signal. He looked. She was standing near the far end of the room in a dress the color of deep water, and she was laughing at something the woman beside her had said. The laugh was genuine. He could tell from across the room, the way you can tell the difference between real weather and a painting of weather. Her hair was drawn back, but not tightly. She had the quality of a person who had dressed with care, but who wore her clothes rather than being worn by them. She was young, younger than he had expected, for reasons he could not yet articulate. It was as though he had already been expecting her, though he could not have explained this expectation. She was perhaps 30. He was 45. He looked away. He returned to the conversation about water access. He looked back. She had moved slightly, and now he could see her face more fully. And what struck him in a way that had nothing to do with her physical beauty, and everything to do with that quality in him that could not stop seeing, was the expression behind her expression. The laugh was real, but under it, moving like a current beneath the surface of a river, was something watchful. Something calculating. Something that did not match the warmth above it. He noted this. He filed it. He did not dismiss it. And then Marcus was at his elbow saying, "There she is," and everything moved forward. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Her name was Celeste Vane. She was 29. She had grown up in a city 300 miles south, and had come to this city 4 years ago with a communications degree and a job at a boutique public relations firm that had since folded. She now worked, Marcus told him with the casual precision of a man who had researched this thoroughly, at a small cultural consulting firm. She was very good at her job. She was charming. She was warm. She was, Marcus said, perfect. Theodore had noted, over the years, that Marcus's assessment of women generally aligned with Marcus's assessment of what would be good for Theodore, which was itself a projection of what Marcus thought would make Theodore easier to manage. He noted this now too. He filed it. But when she turned, when Marcus brought him close enough and spoke her name, and her eyes moved to Theodore's face with that particular quality of genuine attention, the focus of a person who is really, truly looking, something in Theodore's chest rearranged itself. She said, "Mr. Ashford, I've heard about the Foundation's work in Lagos, the Water Access Initiative," and she named the project correctly, precisely, and asked a question about it that was not a flattering question, not a polite question, but a real question, a question that suggested she had read about it and thought about it and arrived at something she genuinely wanted to understand. Theodore answered it. He answered honestly, including the parts where the initiative had struggled, because he had found that most people with good questions deserved honest answers. She listened. She asked a follow-up question. They talked for 40 minutes. Marcus drifted away. The dinner was announced. They were not seated near each other, and Theodore felt the absence of the conversation the way you feel the absence of warmth when a door to the outside opens. He sat through dinner thinking about the current beneath the river, the watchfulness, the calculation. He thought about the 40 minutes of genuine connection that had preceded this noticing. He thought about how it was possible for both of those things to be real at once. He thought about how he was 45 years old and had a son and a mansion full of people who needed him, and had not in many years, felt the particular quality of wanting that had settled into his chest during that conversation, not wanting something from a person, but wanting to know more about a person, wanting to sit in their company and find out what they were made of. He was a careful man. He had learned carefulness at great cost. He was also, underneath the carefulness and despite all evidence to the contrary, and in direct opposition to every lesson experience had spent decades trying to teach him, a man entirely capable of hope. He took out his phone under the table and sent Marcus a message that said, "Tell me more about Celeste Vane." Marcus's reply came in under 90 seconds. It said, "I thought you'd never ask." Chapter 4. The Slow Architecture of Trust. They met again at a smaller event the following week, which Theodore later understood Marcus had engineered, though at the time he attributed it to coincidence. A gallery opening for a photographer whose work Theodore genuinely admired, and there was Celeste standing before a large black and white print of an empty street in winter, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, her head slightly tilted, her expression one of such complete absorption that Theodore stood back for a full minute before announcing himself, because he did not want to interrupt it. She saw him. She smiled, and the smile was different from the one at the dinner, less performance, more surprise. Less the smile of a woman who has been told to be charming, and more the smile of a woman who is genuinely pleased, or at least so it appeared. He held both possibilities simultaneously, the way he had learned to hold uncertainty in all things. They walked through the gallery together. She knew things about photography. Not in the way people know things in order to perform their knowledge, but in the way you know things because you have spent private time with them when there was nothing to gain from it. She talked about the photographer's use of negative space with the enthusiasm of someone who has thought about this alone and is startled to find a listener. Theodore said very little. He was a better listener than a talker, except in the specific conversations where he felt entirely himself, and this conversation was beginning to feel like one of those. They left the gallery and walked 2 blocks in the direction of her train, and then stood at the corner longer than the walk would warrant, because neither of them was in a particular hurry to resolve the problem of what came next. She looked at him sideways. Someone who fills a room differently than you do. This, he would think about later. He would think about it many times. He asked if she would like to have dinner. She said yes and gave him her number and walked down into the train station, and he stood on the corner in the early October cold and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the terrifying specific happiness of a beginning. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. They had dinner 3 times in October. Each dinner was longer than the last, which was generally a good sign. She was funny in a dry, understated way that required attention to notice, which suited him exactly. She was direct about her opinions on things, art, governance, the quality of the breadbasket at the restaurant on Meridian Street, but she was not aggressive about them, not the kind of person who needed to be agreed with. She seemed genuinely interested in being disagreed with, in fact, in the slight, pleasurable friction of encountering a mind that did not move in the same patterns as her own. He told her about the Foundation's work. He told her about the Barlow acquisition. He told her about the study and the books that were colonizing the floor and the fountain that still didn't work. He did not tell her about Elliot. Not yet. Elliot was too important to be offered carelessly. He had learned this the hard way, with a woman 3 years ago who had said all the right things and then, when she had met the boy and registered the reality of the commitment, had gone very quiet and then very absent. He would wait. He would watch. He would not rush. He watched Celeste carefully over those October dinners. He watched the way she handled service staff, generous, specific, not performing generosity but practicing it without audience. He watched the way she spoke about her own life, the city she came from, the parents who were both gone now, the smaller ordinary griefs and pleasures of a life built without a safety net. He watched for the watchfulness he had seen beneath her laugh at the dinner, and he found traces of it. A moment in the second dinner, when she had asked about the breadth of his charitable foundation with a precision that suggested she wanted to understand its structure, and a moment in the third when she had asked, very casually, what kind of legal arrangements he had made for the manor. He had answered both questions. He always answered questions. He had also noted them. He always noted things. But he was in love. He knew he was in love the way you know a fact about the weather. Not because you want it to be true, not because you have decided to believe it, but because you walked outside and got wet. He had not planned it. He had not particularly wanted it. He had been content, in his private assessment, with a life that was full if not complete, a life that included Elliot and the manor and the foundation and the work and the not quite loneliness of being a man with many people around him. And then she had said, I watch rooms too, and something had given way. He knew the risk. He knew the watchfulness he had seen. He held all of this, careful and clear-eyed, in one hand. In the other hand, he held the hope. The terrible, stubborn, impossible to extinguish hope. He was 45 years old and had a son and a mansion full of people who needed him and a heart that refused, absolutely refused, to stop believing the world would eventually treat him as well as he treated it. This was his gift and his wound and the mechanism of everything that came next. Chapter 5, Elliot. He told Celeste about Elliot on the 4th dinner. He had planned to wait longer. He had told himself he would wait longer. But they were sitting in a restaurant that was perhaps the nicest he had taken her to, a place with very good wine and very small portions, and a menu that described the ingredients of each dish in such loving detail that Theodore always felt slightly guilty eating anything. And she had said something about permanence, about the way she thought about the future, about what she wanted to build, and he had found that he could not answer honestly without including the most important fact of his life. She stilled. Not dramatically, she was a person of controlled responses, but he saw the adjustment happen, the recalibration. So he told her about Elliot. He told her about the February morning and the hospital corridor and the 11 minutes and the shift of the tectonic plate. He told her about the dinosaur shirt and the carrot and the missing shoe. He told her about the way the boy could concentrate on a thing he loved with an intensity that was almost frightening for a 5-year-old, and about the way he laughed, with his whole face, not just his mouth, and about the questions he asked, which were the questions of someone who was genuinely trying to understand the world rather than to perform the process of learning. He talked about Elliot for 20 minutes. He had not planned to talk for 20 minutes. But once he started, he found that he was constitutionally incapable of speaking about his son briefly, the way some people are constitutionally incapable of summarizing a book they love. When he stopped, Celeste was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Something softer. Something that looked, at its edges, like being moved, She smiled at that. A real smile, not the calibrated one. The kind that reached before she could control it. He looked at her for a long moment. He was, as always, reading beneath the surface, the current, the calculation, the watchfulness. He saw something genuine in her face at this moment. He could not be certain. He would never be entirely certain with her, which was both his sharpest insight and the thing he had decided, in the privacy of his own chest, to live with. She nodded. She did not press. He watched her not pressing and filed this too. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. He asked Marcus what he knew about Celeste's financial situation. He asked this obliquely, the way you ask oblique questions when you already suspect the answer and are not ready to receive it directly. Marcus said that Celeste was, by any objective measure, not wealthy. The consulting firm paid reasonably. She had some savings. She owned nothing significant. He said this in the tone of a man offering a neutral fact, which was, Theodore noted, how Marcus delivered most things he wanted Theodore not to look at too hard. Theodore was quiet. Marcus leaned back. His expression was one of patient, slightly amused affection. The expression of a man who is watching someone take the long way around a destination he has already decided they will reach. Theodore looked at his friend of 20 years, who knew his loneliness better than anyone, who had sat with him through the failures and the grief and the long quiet evenings, and who had always been present. He said, maybe. And then he went home to his son and sat on the floor of Elliot's room, while the boy showed him the drawing he had made. A house, with what appeared to be a family of triangles standing outside it, labeled in crooked 5-year-old letters. Papa me MRS Brig, and then a figure that was labeled simply. Elliot studied his own drawing with the seriousness of a small curator. I don't know yet, he said, but I left room. Theodore looked at the triangle with the question mark. He put his arm around his son's small shoulders. He thought, I left room too. Chapter 6. The Proposal. 5 months passed in the manner of the best months, slowly enough to be inhabited, quickly enough to be believed. By February, Celeste had been to the manor 4 times. She had met Elliot, who had greeted her with the pragmatic assessment of a small person conducting an interview, and had then asked her within the first 3 minutes whether she could make a sound like a dinosaur. She had made an extremely good sound like a dinosaur. Elliot had approved. Mrs. Briggs had offered her opinion, which she delivered to Theodore alone, in the kitchen, while he was eating soup he had been instructed not to comment on. She's very beautiful, Mr. Theodore. Mrs. Briggs made a sound that was not quite agreement. Theodore ate his soup. It was in fact slightly oversalted. He said nothing. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. He proposed in March. He proposed in the study, in the evening, with the lamps on and the books on the floor, and Elliot asleep upstairs, and the fountain in the drive not working. And it was not a romantic proposal in the way of films. He did not kneel, though he had considered kneeling and decided against it on the grounds that kneeling required getting back up again in a way that he had never managed gracefully. And there was no ring in a box, because he had asked her, 2 weeks earlier, in what he thought was a fairly transparent leading conversation, what kind of ring she might theoretically consider meaningful, and she had said, surprisingly, that she didn't care about rings, that she found them symbolic at best and performative at worst. He had liked her better for this. He had also bought a ring, because he was a man who had built a company from nothing and understood that preparation and spontaneity were not opposites. He said, I want to ask you something, and I want to say it plainly. I'm not a man who does things indirectly when I can do them directly. I'm not young. I know what I look like, Celeste, and I know what I am, and I know that there are 50 reasons a woman your age and your particular quality of beauty and intelligence would choose differently. But I am asking anyway, because I love you. I have watched you carefully for 5 months, and I love you, and I want to build something with you, and I want Elliot to grow up knowing you. Will you marry me? She looked at him. Her eyes were bright. Her face, in the lamplight, was very beautiful, and he watched the current beneath the surface and the warmth above it, and both were present, and he held both in his hands. She said yes. He put the ring on her finger. She held his hand in both of hers for a long moment, and he looked at their joined hands, and he was aware, distantly like a sound from another room, that he did not know if what she felt was what it looked like. He was also aware, with equal clarity, that he had decided to risk it. Some decisions are made with the head, some with the heart. Theodore Ashford had spent his whole life making decisions with his head, while his heart ran ahead of him into territory that the head would have mapped more cautiously. He was doing it again. He knew. He said yes to the knowing. He said yes to the risk. He said yes to the possible catastrophe of hope. He was, after all, a man who had built his entire empire on exactly this quality, the willingness to bet on something that could be lost. Chapter 7. What Marcus and Celeste knew. What Theodore did not know was this. Celeste and Marcus had been together for 2 years. Not openly. Not in any way that anyone in Theodore's orbit would have seen, because Marcus was exceedingly careful. Careful in the way of a man who has thought through a plan from every angle and has identified and neutralized each exposure. They met in a flat on the other side of the city that Celeste kept under her maiden name. They spoke through a secondary phone that Marcus kept in his car. They were, by every observable measure, 2 people who barely knew each other. The plan was Marcus's. He had told Celeste, "You marry him. We wait a year, perhaps 2. You make yourself indispensable. You make him trust you completely. And then we move, assets restructured, accounts accessible, the documentation in place. And by the time anyone understands what has happened, we are untouchable." Celeste had understood this to mean financial manipulation. The kind of thing that happened in divorces, the kind of thing that expensive lawyers fought over for years. She was not proud of it, but she had looked at her life, the debt, the father who had died leaving nothing, the mother who was sick, the gap between what she had and what she needed, and she had said yes to Marcus the way people say yes to things that are wrong when they are desperate enough, and when the person offering is someone they love. She loved Marcus, or she believed she loved Marcus, which at the beginning of this story was the same thing for her. She had not expected Theodore. She had expected a version of him that she had already prepared herself for. The rich, oblivious, grateful man who would be easy to charm and easier to leave. The man she had been briefed on by Marcus, who had described him with the affectionate dismissiveness of someone who knows a person's weaknesses too well. She had not expected the man who watched rooms rather than filled them. She had not expected the directness, the clarity, the quality of attention he brought to her that was entirely unlike the attention of men who wanted only to be seen by her. She had not expected to find herself, at the end of their second dinner, explaining her own opinions about photography as though she had been waiting for someone to ask. She had not expected to sit across from him in the 5th month and feel something complex and ungovernable in her chest when he said "I love you" with the plainness of a man who means exactly what he says. She had not expected any of this. But she had said yes anyway, because she was afraid of Marcus, because she was afraid of the debt, because she had convinced herself that what she felt in Theodore's presence was not love but familiarity, not connection but skillful observation, not something real but something she was doing to herself. She was wrong about this. She would not know she was wrong about this for a long time. What Celeste did not know was this. Marcus had his own plan, separate from and running beneath the plan he had shared with her. Marcus had worked for Theodore Ashford for 14 years. He had watched the man build something extraordinary and had positioned himself close enough to benefit from it while being unable, at his most honest, to claim that he had contributed to it in any foundational way. He was very good at what he did. He was not Theodore. He had understood this for years, and the understanding had curdled slowly, from admiration into resentment into something darker. He wanted the money. Not some of it, not the tidy portion that a financial manipulation would yield, not the settlement that a clever lawyer might extract. He wanted all of it. The company's, the foundation's assets, the manor, the accounts. He had, with the patience of a very careful man, spent 3 years preparing documentation. Legal pathways, most of them barely legal. Power of attorney frameworks he had maneuvered Theodore into signing as routine administrative updates. Trust structures he had guided Theodore to establish for tax purposes that had secondary, non-obvious beneficiary clauses. But documentation alone was not enough. There were contingencies that required Theodore's absence. Permanent absence. He had thought about this too. He had thought about it with the clean, methodical focus of a man who has separated himself sufficiently from his own conscience that the thinking feels like planning rather than what it was. The wedding would be in the summer. A year afterward, perhaps less if circumstances warranted it, there would be an accident. Something conclusive. Something that left no room for recovery. He had already researched what that would look like. He had, in fact, already made the first arrangements. He was in the quiet, deep room behind the easy smile and the silver car and the 20 years of friendship, not the man Theodore believed him to be. He was never the man Theodore believed him to be. This is the oldest story. The trusted man. The open door. The knife not carried visibly. Chapter 8, The Summer Wedding. They were married in July, on the south lawn of Ashford Manor, under the old oak trees that Joseph Crane had spent 3 weeks decorating with white lights, and the fountain, Theodore had finally called the repair man, worked for the first time in 4 years. Elliot was the ring bearer. He performed this function with the solemn authority of a 6-year-old who has been told that this is extremely important and has decided, therefore, that it is extremely important. He walked in a perfectly straight line, looking neither left nor right, holding the small cushion with both hands as though transporting something fragile and irreplaceable. He was, as ring bearers go, magnificent. Theodore stood at the end of the aisle. He had refused to use the word aisle on the grounds that they were on a lawn. In the suit his tailor had now made for him 3 times, one version of which he had spilled coffee on, and he watched Celeste walk toward him through the summer light and thought, I know the risk. I know it, and I am choosing it. I am choosing you. She was very beautiful. She was also something else, something he saw in that long approach through the light, something that had become more visible to him over the months, and that he could not name except to say that it looked like a person carrying a weight they had not shown him. She was beautiful and brave and secretly burdened, and he wanted to know what she was carrying, and he was, in the way of a man who loves and therefore accepts incompleteness as the price of the real thing, willing to wait. She reached him. She looked at his face. Her eyes were bright, and the current beneath the river was there as always, but the warmth above it was also there, and he chose to believe, as he had decided to choose, that the warmth was real. Mrs. Briggs cried. She denied this afterward. Marcus stood at Theodore's side as best man, in a suit that cost more than the fountain repairs. He smiled throughout the ceremony with the smooth, opaque certainty of a man who knows how the story ends, and is not in a hurry to get there. He said the right things. He laughed at the right moments. He embraced Theodore afterward with the genuine feeling warmth of a man who has practiced warmth until it is indistinguishable from the real article. Elliot, when it was over, tugged Theodore's jacket and said, in his direct and serious way, Papa, is she our family now? Theodore crouched down to his son's level. Yes, he said, if you want her to be. Elliot looked at Celeste with the focused, honest assessment of a 6-year-old. She's good at dinosaurs, he said. The best, said Theodore. Elliot nodded. Okay, he said. Okay. He took his father's hand and his new stepmother's hand and walked between them toward the party, and Theodore, watching his son walk with such uncomplicated trust between the two of them, felt the full weight of what he was risking and chose, again, to bear it. Chapter 9, the second year. By the second year of the marriage, things had changed in ways that were difficult to name and impossible to ignore. Celeste was present, but increasingly elsewhere. There were evenings when she sat beside him, and yet Theodore had the sensation of speaking across a very large distance, the words arriving at their destination slightly out of phase with her attention. There were weekends when she was gone, consulting work, she said, which was true enough, but returned with something different in her posture, a tightening in the muscles around her jaw that resolved itself only after a day or 2 back inside the routine of the manor. She was kind to Elliot. This Theodore watched with the keenest attention, because it was the thing most difficult to perform consistently, and she was consistent. She read to him. She attended his school concerts. She learned, at Elliot's patient instruction, the name and characteristics of every significant dinosaur in the Cretaceous period, and she was quizzed on this knowledge at breakfast with some regularity. She never failed. She never seemed to resent being quizzed. Whatever she was or was not, in her relationship to Theodore, she was not false in her relationship to his son. This was the thing that complicated everything afterward. Theodore had noted the changes and was making his own preparations. He had said nothing because he had learned, from Mrs. Briggs, from experience, from the hard education of 40-odd years of reading people, that the moment you reveal what you know is the moment you lose the advantage of knowing it. He was not a man who showed his hand, not in business and not, when it truly mattered, in his private life. He had spoken, carefully and in private, with a man named Diron Becky, who was one of the 2 people in the world Theodore trusted with information that could destroy him. Diron was a forensic accountant who had also, in a previous chapter of his life, worked in investigative intelligence, and who now helped Theodore, at generous compensation and in absolute silence, understand situations that Theodore's own instincts were raising alarms about. He had set Diron to work 6 months earlier. The results had not surprised him. They had wounded him, the way a diagnosis wounds even a patient who has privately anticipated it, not because the knowledge is new but because its confirmation removes the last sanctuary of uncertainty, the last place where hope could theoretically hide. Marcus and Celeste. 2 years before he ever met her. The documentation restructuring. The trust clauses. And something else. Something Diron had delivered with the careful precision of a man who understood he was dismantling a world. A record of purchases made under a subsidiary company Marcus controlled. Purchases that included, among other things, a chemical compound that was not illegal to own, but had a very limited range of applications, and one of those applications was accelerant. Theodore had sat with this knowledge for 3 weeks. He had continued to eat breakfast, to sign documents, to play with Elliot on the floor of the study, to treat Marcus with the warmth and trust of a man who suspects nothing. He had also very quietly spoken with Joseph Crane. Joseph, who had been with him for 16 years and who had a quality of loyalty that did not require discussion or performance because it was simply the fact of who he was, who had come to the manor after his wife died and Theodore had offered him a place without making him ask for it. Joseph had listened to everything and had said nothing for a long time and then had said, "What do you need me to do?" Theodore told him. Joseph had nodded once, in the way of a man who has made a decision and will not revisit it, and gone back to his garden. Chapter 10. The Night of the Fire. The night was in November. Theodore knew, because Diron had learned it, that Marcus had set the date. He knew the mechanism, the boiler in the east wing, carefully and undetectably modified, connected to a timer, connected to the accelerant, connected to a sequence that would look, to any investigator, like a catastrophic mechanical failure in an old building. The fire would originate in the east wing. The east wing was where Theodore's private office was. The east wing was where Theodore, by the established habit of years, worked late on Wednesday evenings. He also knew, and this was the piece that had kept him still and sleepless for 3 weeks, that Marcus had arranged for Celeste to be in the manor that evening. To witness. To be present as a grieving widow from the very first moment, her alibi and her grief occurring simultaneously. He did not know if Celeste knew what was coming. He had spent 3 weeks trying to determine this, and could not be certain. On the night in question, Elliot was not in the manor. He was at Mrs. Briggs's sister's house, for miles away, under the pretext of a planned sleepover that Theodore had arranged with Mrs. Briggs 2 weeks before. Mrs. Briggs knew only that Theodore had asked her to ensure the boy was away that night. She had asked no questions. She had simply arranged it. The other staff had been given a rare evening off. Not all at once, which would have been unusual, but in ones and twos throughout the day, each with a specific small errand or personal task, or simply an evening of rest that Theodore had suggested individually, naturally, without urgency. By 9 o'clock, the manor was near empty. Joseph remained. He had refused to leave. Theodore had not argued. At 9:15, Marcus arrived. He said he had papers that needed Theodore's signature by morning. This was plausible, it had happened before, and Theodore accepted it in the study, where they sat together by the fire as they had sat together many times over 20 years. At 9:30, Celeste came in. She said she had stayed to finish some correspondence. She sat on the small sofa near the window with her laptop open. Theodore could see her from his desk. She was not reading correspondence. She was watching him. The room was very quiet. At 9:45, Marcus looked up from his own papers and said, in the casual tone of someone raising a topic that has been on his mind, "Theo, I need to tell you something." Theodore set down his pen. "Celeste and I," Marcus began. He stopped. He started again. His voice had taken on a quality Theodore had never heard from him before. Not smooth, not easy, not the practiced warmth. Something starker. "We've been together for 2 years. Before you ever met her. It was my idea, all of it. The introduction, the marriage. The trust documents you signed. The accounts." The room was very still. Theodore looked at Celeste. She had closed the laptop. She was looking at Marcus with an expression he could not fully read from across the room, but in which he could see, even now, even at this moment, the complexity he had always known was there. Shock, but not surprise. The shock of something long feared becoming real, not the shock of something truly unexpected. "She doesn't know everything," Marcus said. He was not looking at Theodore now. He was looking at a point in the middle distance with the focused calm of a man executing a plan he has rehearsed. "She knows about the money. She doesn't know about—" He paused. The lights in the east wing went out. In the fraction of a second before the sound came, Theodore felt the air in the room change. A subtle shift in pressure, a warmth that did not belong to the fireplace, and then there was a deep, structural sound from the east wing, Not an explosion, but something worse, a long crumpling, and the faint smell of burning reached them even through the closed doors. Marcus finished his sentence. Or rather, Theodore understood that the sentence had already been finished by the event itself. About what else I arranged for tonight. Celeste stood up. Her face had gone white. She said Marcus's name once, sharply, with a quality in her voice that Theodore had never heard from her and that he would think about afterward for a long time. It was the voice of a person discovering that the person they love is not the person they believed they loved. The shock of a particular kind of betrayal. She had not known. He was certain of it now. And he also had approximately 90 seconds before the fire reached the east corridor. He stood from his desk. He looked at Marcus, whom he had loved as a brother for 20 years, and at Celeste, whom he loved still and perhaps always would, and he felt all of it, every particle of it, every weight, pass through him in the space of one breath. Then he walked toward the east corridor. Marcus said his name. There was something in Marcus's voice that might have been surprise, or might have been the beginning of whatever he had prepared to feel at this moment. Theodore opened the corridor door, and the heat came out at him like a hand. He did not stop. Joseph was behind the door. He had been there since 8 o'clock with the specific equipment Theodore had arranged. Not enough to prevent the burn, because the burn was necessary, because disappearance requires a body, or the convincing absence of one, but enough. Enough for what came next. Chapter 11. What the Fire Left. The official investigation lasted 6 weeks, and concluded with the finding that Theodore Emmanuel Ashford had perished in a structural fire caused by a boiler malfunction in the east wing of Ashford Manor on the 14th of November. The evidence was consistent with this finding. There was forensic evidence of human remains, provided with the kind of expertise that does not come cheaply, and that Theodore had arranged through channels that Diron Becky had never asked him to explain, because Diron was a man who understood that some questions, in some circumstances, are not the right questions. The manor passed into the estate. The estate, by the terms of the will, the legitimate will, not the documentation Marcus had spent 3 years maneuvering, went to Elliot, in trust, managed by a trustee Theodore had appointed 18 months ago, a lawyer named Harriet Osei, who had done pro bono work for the foundation, and who had a quality of incorruptible directness that Marcus would spend the next several months discovering the full extent of. The other documentation, Marcus's documentation, was found to be legally contested, the trust clauses problematic, the power of attorney frameworks subject to challenge. Marcus had been meticulous, but Diron had been methodical, and the evidence of fraud, buried in the accounts and the records and the 6-year history of a man placing his fingers quietly on the scales, was sufficient to ensure that Marcus would have considerably more legal difficulty than he had anticipated. None of this happened immediately. It happened slowly, over months, the way justice in complex financial cases tends to happen, in documents, in depositions, in the quiet machinery of lawyers who are paid by the hour and are not in a hurry. What happened immediately was this: the fire was extinguished. The east wing was heavily damaged. The funeral was small. The widow, Celeste, remained in the manor with Elliot and Mrs. Briggs and those of the staff who stayed, because the manor was now the boy's home and there was nowhere to take him, and because Mrs. Briggs, when asked by anyone whether the widow should stay, looked at them with the expression of a woman who understands that a child's loss is the thing that matters most and said, "The boy needs consistency." Marcus visited the manor regularly in the weeks after the fire. He was externally grief-stricken. Internally, he was calculating the timeline for his next moves, which were more complicated now than he had planned, because the legal challenges to his documentation were consuming resources he had not budgeted for, and because Harriet Osei had turned out to be considerably more formidable than a person who appeared in a pro bono portfolio suggested. Celeste watched him visit. She said very little. She sat with Elliot in the evenings and read to him, and answered his questions about where his papa had gone with the careful, loving truthfulness of someone who has decided that a child deserves honesty, even when it costs. She said he was gone. She said she missed him. She said he had loved Elliot more than anything in the world. All 3 of these things were true as she spoke them. She also, in the privacy of her own mind, in the long nights in the room that had been Theodore's, in the silence of a house that still had his books in stacks on the floor of his study that no one had dared move, did something she had not expected to do. She grieved. Not as a performance. Not as a necessary behavior. She grieved because she had not understood, until she lost him, what she had. She had sat across from that man for months and watched him and calculated and told herself that what she felt was something she was manufacturing, something professional, something she could control. And then he had died in a fire in the east corridor of his house, and she had stood in the driveway in the November cold and watched the smoke rise and understood, with the terrible clarity that only loss provides, that she had been wrong. She had loved him. Not entirely. Not cleanly. Not in the full and uncomplicated way of someone who has gone into a thing with open hands. But in the complicated, partial, real way of someone who has tried to prevent themselves from loving and discovered that love does not require permission. She had loved Theodore Ashford, and she had agreed to a plan that had killed him, and she had not known the killing was part of the plan, and all of these things were simultaneously true, and she would live with all of them for the rest of her life. She thought, I should leave. She thought, but Elliot. She stayed. Chapter 12, 3 years in the dark. He was in a great deal of pain. This was the first and most immediate fact of the new life, and it was a fact he had prepared for intellectually without successfully preparing for experientially, because there is a category of knowledge about pain that only pain can teach you. The burns covered the left side of his torso and his left arm and the lower portion of his left shoulder, and they had been treated by a physician in a private clinic in a country, whose name he was not going to write down anywhere, who worked with the focused competence of someone who is being paid extremely well, and who has a talent for not asking questions to which he already knows the answer. The recovery was measured in months, not weeks. It was, at its worst, the kind of suffering that strips away everything that is not essential, that reduces a person to the most fundamental questions. Who are you when you have nothing to perform? What remains? What remained in Theodore was this, his son. The thought of Elliot, alive in the manor, growing, was the thing he returned to in the worst of the nights, the fixed point, the North Star that kept him oriented when the pain and the medication and the grief tried to make the universe unmappable. And the anger. He had not expected the anger to be what it was. He had expected grief, the loss of Marcus, whom he had loved. He had expected something more complex about Celeste, because he had always held more complexity about her than about anything else. What he had not expected was the anger, which was large and clean and specific, and which burned as steadily as the fire that had started all of this, and which he decided, in the long months of recovery, to treat not as an emotion to be managed, but as a resource to be used. He was going to remake himself. Not metaphorically. Literally. He had money. He had always had more money than anyone knew, because Theodore Ashford had a characteristic that was not widely appreciated about him. He was pathologically cautious about financial exposure. The holding companies and the trusts and the investments that Marcus knew about were real, and were large, and were exactly what they appeared to be. But there was also a set of accounts that Theodore had established 12 years ago, quietly, methodically, in the manner of a man who has read enough history to know that everything can be taken, and who would not be caught without a foundation. The foundation was intact. He accessed it through a chain of entities that led nowhere warm. He was, for all practical purposes, a man who did not exist. He began. *****. The physical transformation took 2 years and required the kind of commitment that is only possible when you have nothing else. He trained with the focused aggression of someone who has identified the body as a project and is not interested in compromise. He found, to his surprise, that he was capable of physical transformation in ways he had never tested, had never needed to test, had never particularly wanted to test, because he had long ago accepted his body as a fact to be worked with rather than a canvas. But the body, given sufficient time and sufficient application and sufficient fury, does not remain a fact. It becomes a statement. The surgeries were considered specific and performed by the best hands available. Not the rhinoplasty of vanity, but the reconstruction of a man who has decided that his previous face is no longer serviceable. The jaw reshaped, the nose corrected, the burn scars where possible addressed. The result was not a mask but a new face, genuinely new, the kind of new that came from the combination of different bone structure and altered features and the physical transformation of a man who had lost 15 pounds of softness and replaced it with something harder. He was unrecognizable. He knew this because Dyron Becky, whom he had trusted with his survival, and who had been the only person in the world who knew Theodore Ashford was alive, had looked at him across a table in a small city far from home, and had stared for a long, uncomfortable moment before saying, "I wouldn't have known you." "Good," said Theodore. He had a new name, a new documentation history, built with the same methodical care he had brought to everything. He was Elias Vance. He was 39, shaving 6 years from his real age, which the surgeries and the body transformation made plausible. He was a consultant, recently arrived from abroad, looking for work. He had a plan. He was going home. Chapter 13, The Return. Ashford Manor required, in the 3 years since the fire, 2 contractors and an insurance claim and an architectural firm to restore the east wing to something resembling its original condition. The work had been managed by the estate trustees and funded by the insurance settlement, which had been, in Theodore's careful prior arrangement, extremely comprehensive. The manor was beautiful again. The fountain worked. The ivy on the east wing was new and young, and had not yet had time to commit to its pattern. The staff had mostly remained. Mrs. Briggs was still there, older by 3 years, and with a new recipe for soup that she was deeply proud of. Joseph Crane was still there. Amara. Felix, who had finished his accounting degree and was now, with considerable irony, helping with the estate's finances under the supervision of Harriet O'Say. Samuel and George were still there, still arguing about football. New people had come too. Celeste had brought her mother, who was ill, and her mother's nurse. A young woman named Priya, who helped with Elliot's education, and who had come through the same networks the foundation had established. And Marcus. Marcus was there often. The legal challenges to his documentation had consumed 2 years and a great deal of his money, and had ultimately resolved in a settlement that left him less than he had planned for, but not without resources. He had conducted himself through this process with the smooth, unruffled quality of a man who has been to the edge and knows how to appear unshaken by it. He visited the manor because Celeste was there, and because the manor was where the money ultimately lived, and because Marcus was not a man who abandoned a position while there was still ground to hold. The estate was Elliot's. This was the immovable fact. And Elliot was 8 years old now, growing, with those ears that were beginning to fit his face, and a gap in his teeth that had resolved itself, and a quality of seriousness that had deepened rather than faded, and who played the piano with an intensity that startled people who heard him for the first time. No one in the household played the piano. No one had taught him. He had simply begun at the age of 7 to sit at the old piano in the second sitting room, and to find notes that arranged themselves into something recognizable. Mrs. Briggs said it was a gift from God. Priya said it was evidence of natural aptitude. Celeste sat outside the sitting room door sometimes in the evenings and listened, and felt something she could not name. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Elias Vance applied for a position at Ashford Manor through the estate's General Inquiries contact, which was managed by Felix. He applied as a general estate manager and maintenance consultant, a new role, not a replacement for anyone, but a position that the estate, with its ongoing restoration and its complex operational needs, genuinely required. Harriet O'Say interviewed him by telephone. She found him competent, well-referenced, and appropriately straightforward. She offered a probationary arrangement. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in April. He drove up the gravel drive in a car that was not the silver car. He got out and stood in front of the fountain that he had bought for $900,000 on a Thursday afternoon, because it reminded him of a fountain he had seen in a photograph of Rome. The fountain was working. He looked at it for a moment. Mrs. Briggs opened the front door. She looked at him across the drive with the sharp, comprehensive assessment of a woman who has been reading people for 70 years and who has very little patience with pretense. She looked at his face, his build, his hands, his way of standing. Something in her expression shifted. He could not read it clearly from this distance. She said, in her way, "You'll want to come in, then." He walked across the gravel he had walked across 1,000 times. He went inside. He was home. Chapter 14, What Elias Saw. He saw everything. This had always been true of Theodore Ashford, and it was no less true of Elias Vance, because the name was new but the mechanism was not, and the mechanism was the thing that could not be surgically altered or trained away. He had the same quality of attention. He saw people with the same aching, comprehensive clarity. The only difference was that no one here knew to expect it from him. In the first week, he mapped the manor's dynamics the way he would have mapped a company. The formal structures and the informal ones, the loyalties and the tensions, the habits that revealed everything about a person's internal life. He saw that Mrs. Briggs ran the household with the same absolute authority she always had, and that no one questioned this because her judgment was never wrong, and that she had added to her established habits the new habit of listening very carefully when Elliot played the piano, and then going into the kitchen immediately afterward and busying herself with something vigorous. He saw that Felix had grown into something genuinely capable. The accounting degree had given him a framework for a mind that had always been organized, and he now managed the estate's day-to-day finances with a diligence that was almost excessive. He saw that Joseph Crane maintained the gardens with, if anything, greater care than before, and that there was a quality in Joseph's attention to the grounds, in the way he tended certain plants, in the way he walked certain paths, that looked very much like love for a person rather than love for a garden. He saw that Amara, who had known her employer for 15 years and had trusted him with her safety and her children's futures, had developed a stillness since the fire that was not natural to her. Not grief exactly, something more watchful. He saw that Marcus visited 3 times in the first week alone, always unannounced, always with a slightly proprietorial quality, moving through the manor with the ease of a man who has decided that possession is 9/10 of it. He saw Marcus look at him twice on the second visit with the brief, efficient appraisal of a man who has learned to assess threats. He saw Marcus conclude from this assessment that he was not a threat. This was a calculation Theodore could have once made himself. He saw Celeste. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. He had not been prepared for this part. He had told himself, in the 3 years of remaking himself, that he had processed his feelings about Celeste with sufficient thoroughness to encounter her without complication. He had sat with the facts. She had agreed to Marcus's plan. She had lied to him from the beginning of their relationship. She had married him under false pretenses. He had also sat with the other facts. She had not known about the fire. She had stayed for Elliot. She had grieved, genuinely, in ways that Dyron had quietly reported to him in the first year. He had told himself that he had arrived at a clear-eyed view of who she was and what she had done, and that he felt about it what was appropriate. He had been wrong. She came into the kitchen on his 3rd morning at the manor, while he was having coffee with Mrs. Briggs, who had decided, in the characteristic manner of Mrs. Briggs, which was to decide things and then implement them without discussion, that the new estate manager should be included in the morning kitchen assembly, that she ran like a small but serious parliament. Celeste came in without noticing him, in the way of someone who is still inside a thought they have not finished. She was wearing a dark blue cardigan that he did not recognize. Everything she owned was from after. She was thinner than he remembered, or perhaps she seemed thinner because she was less radiant than he remembered. The particular radiance that had struck him at the Caldwell dinner softened now into something quieter and more honest, and therefore, infuriatingly more moving. She poured coffee. She said good morning to Mrs. Briggs with the warm, easy familiarity of 3 years of shared mornings. She turned and saw him. "Oh," she said, "you must be the new manager." "Yes," he said. "Elias." She looked at him for a moment. Directly, with that quality of attention he had always noticed in her, the watching beneath the surface. "Celeste," she said. "Welcome." She took her coffee and left the kitchen. He sat with Mrs. Briggs and felt the coffee warm in his hands, and looked at the door through which she had passed, and understood that he was in significantly more trouble than he had planned for. Mrs. Briggs, without looking up from the bread she was preparing, said, "Biscuit?" "Thank you," he said. He ate the biscuit. He did not feel any better. Chapter 15. The Boy at the Piano. Elliot was 8 years old, and very serious about things. He was serious about dinosaurs, though the specific field of his expertise had migrated somewhat in the 3 years since his father's death. He was now interested in all of natural history, with particular attention to extinction events, which he discussed with the focused energy of a scientist rather than the morbid enthusiasm one might have feared. He was serious about the piano. He was also, and this was the thing that the household had come to discuss in hushed tones, and with the reverence usually reserved for the genuinely inexplicable, serious about certain things that he should not have been able to know. He played pieces that no one had taught him. Not improvised pieces, not the wandering compositions of a child finding notes, but actual pieces, specific, identified pieces. He had, at the age of 7, played the opening movement of a sonata that Mrs. Briggs's late husband had played on his own piano, which had been in their house when she was first married, and which she had not heard in 40 years, and which she had never mentioned to anyone at the manor. She had stood in the corridor outside the sitting room with her hand over her mouth, and her eyes very wide for the full 3 minutes he played it. When he finished, she had gone in and asked him where he had heard that music. He had said, with the matter-of-fact directness that was entirely his, "In my head." He knew things, too. Small things, private things, the name of the fountain's repairman, who was in fact named Gerald and whom no one had mentioned to him. The fact that the old oak on the south lawn had lost a branch in a storm when Theodore was a boy. This was true, confirmed by Joseph Crane with a quality of disturbed silence that he did not explain. He had told Priya once, unprompted, the exact combination of the old safe in the East Wing library, which had been reset after the fire, and which the combination for was known to exactly 2 people. No one had told him. He had simply known. Mrs. Briggs said it was the hand of God. Joseph said nothing. Celeste said, carefully, that children sometimes absorbed more than they were given credit for. The household accepted this explanation because the alternative was more complicated, and people generally prefer the explanation that requires the least restructuring of what they believe. Asterisk. Elias met Elliot on his 4th day, formally, in the south garden where the boy was conducting what appeared to be a detailed inspection of the flower bed that ran along the east wall. He crouched down beside him. "What are you looking for?" Elias looked at the flower bed. "He's right. These grounds are too recent geologically. You'd need sedimentary rock exposure for fossil deposits." Elliot looked up. He assessed the new estate manager with the frank, comprehensive efficiency of a small scientist. "You know about geology?" "A little." "Tell me what you know about it first," said Elias. Elliot told him. He told him at length, with the precision of someone who has studied a subject for personal reasons rather than academic ones, which is the kind of knowledge that has a different quality to it, deeper, less arranged, more genuinely owned. Elias listened the way he had always listened to his son, without looking at anything else, without performing interest, with the whole of his attention. When Elliot finished, he said, "You listen like my papa used to." Elias said nothing. The question was unexpected. "No," said Elias. "My papa played the cello," said Elliot. "He wasn't very good, but he played it every Sunday. I remember. Theodore had played the cello. Badly. On Sunday evenings, alone in the study, for approximately 45 minutes, and then he would put it away because he found the imperfection of his own playing simultaneously soothing and infuriating. He had never played it for anyone. He had certainly never played it where an 8-month-old could hear. But Elliot was 6 years old when Theodore died. He had said, "I remember." Elias looked at his son. He said, in a voice very carefully controlled, "He sounds like he was a good father." Elliot considered this with the same focused seriousness he brought to everything. Elias stood up. He brushed the soil from his knees. He said, "I think you might be right." He walked back toward the manor. He stopped at the fountain. He stood there for a long time. He was crying, though he had not cried since the hospital, and he had not expected to cry now, but the grief had found a crack. The boy's certainty, the way he had said "best father," the absolute trust in his voice, and had come through it. Chapter 16. The Strange Man. The household had been discussing Elias Vance among themselves from the first week, because the household was a collection of people who had lived in close quarters for many years and who had developed, of necessity, a sophisticated internal communication system that did not require formal meetings or memos. The discussion, which occurred in various configurations in the kitchen and the corridor and the laundry room where Amara worked and the garden where Joseph worked, covered the following points. First, he was very good at his job. There was no disputing this. He had assessed the estate's maintenance needs in 48 hours and produced a 3-month plan that was so precisely calibrated to the building's actual requirements that Felix, reviewing it, had made a sound of impressed disbelief. Second, he knew things he shouldn't know. Not the way Elliot knew things, not the inexplicable things, but the specific, practical things of a man who has been inside this building before. He knew which door stuck. He knew which window did not fully seal, and that this affected the west bedroom in cold weather. He had walked directly to the circuit panel in the basement without being told where it was, and when Samuel had said he could show him, he had said, "I think I've got it," with the absent confidence of someone remembering rather than discovering. Third, he was strange. Not unpleasant. Not off-putting. But strange in a particular way. The way of someone who is keeping something very large very quiet, and who is doing this with such practiced ease that the effort only becomes visible when you know to look for it. Amara told Joseph that she thought the new man was in pain. Not physical pain, or not only. "He looks at things here," she said, "the way you look at things when you are remembering them and the memory hurts." Joseph listened to this and said nothing. Mrs. Briggs said in the kitchen, while producing soup that was now quite correctly salted, that the new man put her in mind of someone. She did not say who. When pressed by Felix, who was always the one to press, she said she couldn't put her finger on it. She said it with a quality of deliberate imprecision that Felix found unusual, because Mrs. Briggs was not a woman who was ever imprecise about anything by accident. Samuel said he thought Elias was probably military, based on the way he carried himself. George said he thought Elias was probably ex-intelligence services, based on the way he registered every exit. Priya said she thought they were both being absurd. The table was quiet. Celeste looked up from her coffee. She looked at Elliot and then, briefly, toward the door through which Elias had just departed with the quality of attention she brought to things that mattered. "What kind of things?" she asked. Elliot ate his toast. "All kinds," he said. "Just all kinds." Mrs. Briggs carried a bowl to the sink. Joseph, who was taking his morning coffee at the kitchen table rather than in the garden, which was unusual, looked down at his cup with an expression that he managed to render completely unreadable. Chapter 17. The Evening of the Storm. There was a storm in May, the first proper storm of the year, the kind that comes with serious intent. Not an April shower that apologizes for its own inconvenience, but a full-throated May storm that understood it was the last of the season and was going to be remembered. The manor handled storms well. It had been handling storms for 140 years, and its walls had the authority of a building that has learned to sit still and let the weather do what it needs to do. But the storm brought down a tree at the north edge of the property, which brought down a section of the perimeter wall with it, and which meant that at 11 o'clock in the evening, in the rain, with a torch, Elias was in the north garden assessing the damage. He heard footsteps on the gravel path and turned. Celeste was standing at the edge of the torch beam in a rain jacket that had clearly been grabbed from a hook rather than selected with any thought, her hair darkening with rain, holding a second torch. "It isn't," he said. "Manageable," he said. "Needs a mason. I'll call in the morning." She nodded. She should have gone back inside. She didn't. They stood in the rain together looking at the wall, which was a sensible thing to look at. The storm was directly overhead now, the thunder close enough to be felt as well as heard, and the light in the garden shifted every 30 seconds with the lightning. "You don't mind the rain," she said. It was not quite a question. "No," he said. "You look," she said, and then stopped. He waited. He looked at her in the unsteady light. "I have been," he said. She turned her torch toward the wall, away from him. "I used to love storms," she said. "I stopped for a while. I think I'm starting again." He did not ask why she had stopped. He knew why she had stopped. He stood in the rain and said nothing, and let her have the statement without pulling it apart. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said suddenly. It was the thing people said when they had established from somewhere that you were a widower, and he had allowed the estate's records to suggest this. "Thank you," he said. He turned and looked at her directly, and her torch was between them throwing light upward, and he could see her face very clearly, and what was in it was true. Not performed, not strategic, but the simple and absolute truth of a person stating the most important fact they know. He looked away. "No," she agreed. They walked back toward the manor in the rain. They did not speak. At the door she paused and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said what was in the air between them, which was something he had not planned for, and which frightened him in a way that the fire had not, because fire is external, and this was not. "Good night, Elias," she said. "Good night," he said. She went inside. He stood in the rain for another minute. He went back to the north garden and stood at the broken wall and thought. This was not in the plan. Chapter 18. Marcus looks twice. Marcus arrived the following week without calling ahead, which was his default mode now, and which communicated, by design, that he considered his presence here unconditional. He walked through the front door that Amara opened for him with the expression of someone tolerating an inconvenience, and straight through to the sitting room where he had decided he would work from for the afternoon. He almost walked into Elias in the corridor. They were face to face for a full 3 seconds. Marcus looked at him. The assessment was rapid and professional and comprehensive. Marcus was good at reading people. It was the skill that had served him best, and he found at the end of it, new hire, estate manager, physically capable, probably ex-military or construction background, eyes that were too intelligent for the role, but not uncommonly so. Nothing that needed attention. "You're the new manager," Marcus said. Less a question than a statement of established fact. "Yes," said Elias. "I know who you are," Elias said. He said it with the even neutral quality of an employee who is stating that he has read the household file, nothing more. Marcus looked at him once more. "Good," he said, and went on to the sitting room. He sat in the sitting room and opened his laptop and thought, briefly, that there was something about the new man that registered in some animal way he couldn't specify. He had experienced this occasionally in his career, the sense of an intelligence he had failed to fully map. He usually followed this instinct. He looked out the window. Elias was crossing the south garden toward the restored east wing, a clipboard in one hand, moving with the unhurried certainty of a man who knows exactly where he's going and why. Marcus watched him. He weighed the instinct. He let it go. He was here to manage Celeste, to assess the legal situation's progress, to evaluate whether Harriet Osei was as unmovable as she appeared. He did not have resources to spare on instincts about an estate manager. He turned back to his laptop. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Elias found Marcus's secondary phone in less than a week. He found it not by searching would have been noticed, but by noticing, in the systematic and involuntary way he noticed everything, that Marcus left the sitting room twice in every visit to make calls on a phone that was different from the phone he used openly. He noted the pattern of the visits, the duration of the calls, the way Marcus's posture changed between the two phones, easier with the open phone, slightly more contained with the other. He did not need the content of those calls. He already knew what they were. What he needed was the timing. He needed to know when Marcus would move, and in which direction, and how much of the legal exposure Marcus had absorbed and how much he had not. He needed to know whether Marcus understood yet that the documentation he had spent 3 years building was not going to yield what he had planned. He needed, most urgently, to know whether Marcus had a contingency. A man like Marcus always had a contingency. Theodore Ashford had once, a long time ago, believed that he knew Marcus well enough to predict him. He had been wrong about this in the most catastrophic way possible. Elias Vance was not going to make the same mistake. He would not assume. He would know. Chapter 19, The Piano. On a Sunday evening in June, Elias passed the sitting room and stopped. Elliot was at the piano. This was not unusual. Elliot was at the piano most evenings. What was unusual was what he was playing. It was the cello sonata in E minor that Theodore had played, badly, on Sunday evenings alone in the study. It was a piece for cello, not piano, and Elliot had translated it to the piano in the way of someone who knows a piece of music from the inside out and can find it on any instrument, and he was playing it with the concentrated, slightly too serious expression of an 8-year-old performing a private devotion. Elias stood in the doorway. Celeste was already there, on the chair beside the window, in the way she sometimes sat, and she looked up when she heard him. Their eyes met. She looked away and back at Elliot. He stayed in the doorway. Neither of them spoke. The music moved through the room, imperfect in Elliot's small hands, deeply felt, specific in a way that music is specific when it has been lived with rather than learned. When it ended, Elliot sat for a moment with his hands still on the keys. Elias looked at the boy. He was aware, with the full sharpness of his attention, that Celeste was watching them both. "Someone told me," he said, "about your father, that he played the cello." The question was simple and direct, and had no diplomatic solution. Elliot considered this with great seriousness. He closed the piano lid with careful hands, and got down from the bench, and said good night with the formal dignity of a small person who understands that the evening has been significant and should be closed properly, and went upstairs. The room was quiet. Elias was still in the doorway. Celeste was still in the chair. They were not looking at each other, and then they were, and the room was very still, and the evening light was doing something particular to the dust in the air, and neither of them spoke for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. "He's remarkable," said Elias. "He said it the way you say something true when you're trying to say something safer." "He is," said Celeste. She said it the same way. "His father was—" She stopped. "Was what?" Elias asked quietly. "I didn't mind," he said. She looked at him. The assessment was not the social assessment she used habitually. This was different. This was the deeper reading, the one she'd had from the beginning, the one she had turned on Theodore in the gallery and in the restaurants and in the lamplight of the study. She was reading him. He held still under it. He did not perform. He simply was, as much as he could be, as much as the situation permitted, himself. She looked away first. "Good night, Elias," she said. "Good night," he said. He went to the east wing, which was his now, and sat for a long time in the dark. Chapter 20, What Mrs. Briggs Knew. She had known from the first morning. Not the shape of it, not the surgery, not the new name, not the 3 years away, but the essential fact. She had opened the front door of the manor she had run for 17 years, and looked across the gravel drive at the man standing by the fountain, and she had known him the way you know a voice even when it's speaking words you've never heard it say. The body is different. The face is different. The posture has changed in ways that speak of great physical transformation. But the way he stood, the slight forward lean, the quality of his stillness, the way his attention moved across the fountain with recognition, this was not a new man. This was her man. She had said, "You'll want to come in, then," because it was the only thing she could say that was neutral enough to cover what she felt, which was the staggering, grief-reversing, terrifying joy of understanding that he was alive. She had gone to Joseph that evening. Joseph had already known. Joseph had been the one who had pulled him out of the East Wing on the night of the fire, who had been there with the equipment Theodore had arranged, who had driven him to the airport in the old truck while the fire engines were still on the drive. Joseph had known every day for 3 years. He had tended the garden for a man he was waiting for. Mrs. Briggs was quiet for a long time. Joseph nodded. They sat in the garden until the stars came out. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Mrs. Briggs watched. She watched him be careful. She watched him keep his distance from Celeste in the deliberate, controlled way of someone managing something that would otherwise run away from them. She watched the moments where the distance narrowed, the corridor, the storm, the piano room, and she watched the quality of his restraint and knew what it cost him. She brought him soup. Not the oversalted soup of before, the corrected recipe, the one she had spent a year perfecting after losing someone to make soup for, and when he ate it without comment she felt something settle in her chest. She also watched Celeste. She had been watching Celeste for 3 years with a complicated and evolving assessment. She had come to the manor as a woman Mrs. Briggs had not trusted, and had stayed as a woman who had surprised her. She had watched Celeste sit with Elliot through nightmares, and through the ordinary grief of a young child who had lost a parent, and through the more complicated grief of a child who was growing up and beginning to be able to understand the full dimension of what was gone. She had watched Celeste read to him and quiz him on dinosaurs, and stand in the hallway listening to him play the piano with an expression that Mrs. Briggs could only describe as penance. She had not forgiven her. She was not sure she would ever forgive her. But she had seen enough to know that Celeste Ashford, still using his name, which she had never been asked about and had never explained, was not the woman she had expected to stay. She was watching Elias now with the particular quality of attention she had once given Theodore. Not identical, the attention adjusted for a different presentation, but the same search. Looking for what was underneath. Looking for the current beneath the river. "She's going to fall in love with him again," Mrs. Briggs said to Joseph one evening. Joseph raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Briggs thought about this for a long time. She was a woman of strong opinions and genuine compassion, and the hard-won understanding that these two things are not always in comfortable alignment. She went back inside to prepare dinner. Joseph remained in the garden, looking at the fountain. Chapter 21. Marcus makes his move. The legal process had resolved, by the middle of the summer, in a way that left Marcus without the financial assets he had planned for but not without resources, because Marcus was a man who had always maintained multiple positions. He was still close to the family. He was still, as far as anyone visible could tell, Celeste's partner. They had stopped pretending otherwise the previous year, which had simplified some things and complicated others. He had a plan he had not abandoned. He had simply revised it. The documentation pathway was closed. Harriet O'Say had seen to that with a thoroughness that Marcus found, in his private assessment, genuinely impressive. But there were other pathways. The estate was Elliot's. Elliot was a minor. A minor's estate could be influenced, in the right circumstances, by the adults who were proximate to that minor's care. He needed Celeste more than ever. And Celeste had been behaving in ways that Marcus found increasingly difficult to read. She was quieter. Not with him specifically. She was quieter in general, in the manner of a person who is having a conversation inside themselves that is more absorbing than the conversations around them. She was attentive to Elliot in a way that had deepened beyond the practical. He had noticed with a sharpening of attention, watching the new estate manager. Marcus had dismissed his initial instinct about Elias twice. He raised it to a concern now. He asked Celeste about him. She said he seemed competent. She said this too flatly, too quickly, in the way of someone who has prepared an answer. Marcus filed this. He hired someone to look into Elias Vance. The investigation returned a clean history, employment records, a residential history in 3 cities, references that checked out, no criminal record, nothing anomalous. The kind of clean history that, to a man who had constructed a clean history himself, was either genuine or excellent. He couldn't tell which. This bothered him. He came to the manor on a Tuesday and found Elias in the restored library in the East Wing, reorganizing the shelving system that had been damaged in the reconstruction. He came in and closed the door and stood with his arms crossed and his best quality of relaxed authority. "How are you settling in?" he asked. "Very well," said Elias. He continued with the shelving. "The family speaks well of you," Marcus said. The question was polite and even, and yet Marcus found, in the 2 seconds he held Elias's gaze, that there was something in it that he did not like. Not hostility, nothing as obvious as hostility. Something more like the patience of a person who is waiting for you to reveal yourself. He left the library. He stood in the East Wing corridor, the restored corridor, bright now, no trace of the fire, and stood there for a moment. The instinct was back, sharper this time. He took out his secondary phone. Chapter 22. The conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. Celeste had developed the habit of walking the north garden in the early morning, before anyone else was reliably awake, because the north garden was where the restored wall met the old stones, and where the light came first, and because she needed, every day, an hour that belonged to no one's needs but her own. She was in the north garden at 6:15, when she heard Marcus on the south terrace. He was on the phone. She could hear him through the stone arch that connected the 2 garden areas, and she stopped because the quality of his voice was different from his public voice. Stripped of the ease, speaking with a clipped precision that she recognized as his actual register, the one he used when he believed no one was listening. She should have moved away. She knew this. She stood still. She heard. The timeline needs to move up. The trust structure is locked, but there are other vectors. The boy is the asset. It doesn't need to be complicated. It needs to be clean. She heard enough. She was a clever woman, Celeste Vane. She had always been clever in the way of someone who had to be, who had grown up without the safety net that makes cleverness optional. She had understood, when she agreed to Marcus's original plan, that she was making a moral compromise. She had told herself the story she needed to tell. The money was there, it was large enough not to be missed, she needed it. She would repay it in some abstract way at some abstract time. She had told herself she loved Marcus. She had told herself a great many things that she had understood, over 3 years, were not true. What she heard on the south terrace was not a story she could tell herself away. He had said, the boy is the asset. He had said, it doesn't need to be complicated. She walked back through the north garden and into the manor and went directly to the kitchen, which was empty at this hour, and she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the south terrace where Marcus was pacing with his phone to his ear and his back to her. She had been standing there for 5 minutes, entirely still, before she became aware that Elias was in the kitchen. He had come in from the East Wing corridor, she hadn't heard him, and he was standing at the counter with a coffee cup, not looking at her, in the way of someone who has correctly assessed that a person needs to be alone in their thinking, and who is present without intruding. "How much did you hear?" she asked. She did not turn from the window. "Enough," he said. She looked at him then. He was watching her with the quality of attention she had come to recognize as his particular signature. Not a performance, not a search for a reaction, but the real reading. The honest one. "What do I do?" she said. It was not the question she had intended to ask. She had intended to say something more controlled, something that kept the distance in place. But the question came out of her before she could manage it. Elias set down his coffee cup. He looked at her directly. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him. She said nothing. But she did not look away. Chapter 23. She is looking. It began not as a moment, but as an accumulation. She noticed that he was always where the difficulty was, not aggressively, not asserting himself, but simply present when things needed managing. The stone wall after the storm. The legal paperwork that Felix was struggling with, and that Elias had quietly helped him understand on a Saturday afternoon without being asked. The evening that Elliot had a fever and could not sleep, and Elias had sat in the corridor outside Elliot's room, at Mrs. Briggs's suggestion, and played something very quiet on a small instrument she hadn't seen him bring. Not the cello, something smaller, a melodica perhaps, until the boy settled. He had not known she was watching from the far end of the corridor. Or perhaps he had. She wasn't sure. She noticed the way he spoke to Elliot, the way he listened to the boy the way very few adults could, not waiting for the child to be done, but actually arriving where the child was, inside the thing the child cared about, curious and present. She noticed that he never volunteered information about himself that she hadn't asked for, and that when she did ask he answered honestly, but without excess, without the performing of intimacy that she recognized as its counterfeit. She noticed that he looked at her sometimes with an expression she could not fully name, something behind his eyes that she kept almost catching and then losing, like a reflection at the edge of a mirror. She noticed, with a specific and unsettling quality of attention, that he reminded her of Theodore. Not superficially, they did not look alike, they did not sound alike. The new physical fact of Elias Vance was nothing like the man she had married. But in something more essential, the quality of attention, the way of listening, the absolute, unperforming quality of his presence, the thing that had first stripped away her careful distance in the second dinner she and Theodore had shared, when he had disagreed with her about something, and she had found herself delighted by it. She had thought, in those early months with Theodore, that she was performing interest. She had discovered she was wrong. She was beginning to be afraid she was wrong again. It frightened her because she did not know who she was in this specific context. She was a woman who had loved one man and betrayed him. A woman who had used love as a tool and had been used in return. A woman who had stayed past the point of strategy because a child needed her, and who had found, in staying, that something in her had slowly, and without announcement, been repaired. She did not know if she deserved to feel what she was beginning to feel. She thought about this in the North Garden in the early mornings. She thought about it in the evenings when she heard Elliot at the piano. She thought about it in the kitchen, in the now established habit of early morning coffee that had become, somehow, a fixture of her days. Herself and Elias and sometimes Mrs. Briggs, and a quality of ordinary easiness that she was afraid to name, because naming things makes them real, and real things can be lost. She thought, I am falling in love with this man. She thought, I have been here before. She thought, but not like this. Not this honestly. Because this was different from what she had felt for Marcus, which she understood now had been something that wore the clothes of love without inhabiting them. And it was different even from what she had felt for Theodore, which had been real but contaminated from the start by what she was doing, the layer of guilt that had made everything bittersweet. This was uncontaminated. This was her, simply, without agenda or plan or architecture, sitting in a kitchen in the early morning looking at a man across a table and feeling the specific terrifying vulnerability of wanting someone to know you completely. She could not afford this. She was going to feel it anyway. Chapter 24. Dairon Becky came to the manor in August as a legal consultant retained by the estate's trustees, which was a role he had actually taken on in addition to his existing knowledge, because Harriet O'Say had engaged him legitimately, and because this was the kind of arrangement that pleased Theodore, or Elias, with its layered efficiencies. He was a small, compact man of 60, with close-cut gray hair and eyes of extraordinary precision, and he had the quality of a man who has spent a professional lifetime knowing things no one had told him, and had learned to wear this knowledge as simply as he wore his suit. He and Elias met in the East Wing library and spoke, and spoke, and spoke, and what they spoke about included the status of Marcus's contingency, which Dairon had been monitoring, and which was real and operational and closer than Elias had hoped. The legal timeline, the documentation that existed, and the documentation that needed to exist. The specifics of what was coming and how to position for it. Elias looked at the window. Outside, the south garden was full of late summer light, and Elliot was on the grass with Priya, learning something from a book that he kept turning to show her with the enthusiasm of a person whose delight in knowledge is entirely genuine. I need one more thing, he said. Dairon waited. Dairon looked at him for a moment with the comprehensive attention of a man who has known Theodore Ashford for 12 years and has watched him hold hope like a bruised but unbroken thing. Elias sat with this. She didn't know about the fire, he said. Elias was quiet for a long time. What would you do? Dairon asked. Elias looked at his son on the grass, at the late summer light, at the fountain that worked. Dairon looked at him. That's not revenge. The quality of Elias's expression changed, not dramatically but perceptibly, the way the weather changes before anyone can name the specific change. Marcus, he said, is a different conversation entirely. Chapter 25. The evening before everything. He found her in the East Wing library. Not in the kitchen, not in the sitting room, but in the library. His library, the one he had spent 17 years filling, the one that had survived the fire in most of its substance because the books were shelved on the west wall and the fire had come from the east. She was sitting in the leather chair in the corner, his leather chair, in the spot he had always used for reading, with a book in her lap and the low lamp on, and the expression of a person who is not reading, but is holding the object of reading as a way of being alone without being idle. She looked up when he came in. He should have said he was looking for a document. He should have kept it brief. He should have. He had a catalog of things he should have done, and he had been doing most of them for 4 months, and tonight, for reasons he could not entirely account for, he was tired of it. He sat down in the chair across from her. They looked at each other. This was his library, she said. It was a statement, not a question. She said it quietly, as though she were placing something fragile down. Yes, he said. He said nothing. He sat very still. He looked at her. You're Elliot's mother, he said. She looked up. She looked at him with an expression he had no word for. Something exposed and grateful and afraid all at once. Something that looked, if you were a man who was willing to see it, exactly like a person arriving at honesty after a very long journey. He looked at her and felt everything, the anger and the grief and the love that had never stopped, that had been there through the surgery and the recovery and the 3 years and the return, steady and unreasonable and absolutely his. He stood. She stood too, instinctively, as though she were not ready for the conversation to end. They were standing very close. He said her name. Not Celeste, which was her name. He said it differently, the way you say a word when you have been keeping it inside for a very long time, and it has become something other than a word. She went still. She looked at him for a long time. He left the library. She sat back down in the leather chair and held the book she was not reading and looked at the door and understood, with the particular and devastating clarity of a person who has finally learned to recognize what they are feeling and can no longer choose not to feel it, that she was completely and entirely in love with this man. Chapter 26, Marcus Falls. The events of September moved quickly, in the way of things that have been prepared for carefully, and still arrive before you are entirely ready. Marcus came to the manor on a Wednesday, and this time he brought 2 people with him. Associates, he said, wanting to tour the grounds for a potential arrangement with the estate. Harriet Osei had not authorized a tour. Felix was on holiday. Mrs. Briggs was in town. The circumstances were, in the way of Marcus's best work, almost convincing in their innocence. Elias had been told by Dyron the previous day. He had made his preparations. The 2 associates were met at the door by Amara, who said politely that Mr. Hale had confused the date and that no tour had been arranged. When they persisted, with the specific, pressured quality of men who have been told that persistence is the assignment, they found that the door, while open and welcoming, led to a corridor that was occupied by, progressively, Amara, Samuel, George, Joseph Crane, and a man named Dyron Becky, who had recently arrived and who was on the phone with Harriet Osei, and who said to the associates, in a tone of complete courtesy, that he would be very happy to speak with them about their credentials and their legal authority to be on this property. They left. Marcus was already inside when this was happening. He was in the study, the rebuilt study, Elliot's study now, where Elliot kept his books and his drawings and his notes about natural history, and he was at the desk, and he was looking for something that was not there because it had never been there, because Elias Vance had known this was coming and had made arrangements. What he found instead was Elias, who was standing in the study doorway, and who was, in this moment, not performing the neutrality of an employee. Marcus turned. He looked at Elias. The instinct he had dismissed twice and elevated to a concern once was now loud and unignorable, and he was running his assessment rapidly, looking for the shape of what he was dealing with. "Who are you?" he said. It was not quite a question. Elias looked at him. He looked at the man he had trusted for 20 years. He looked at him with every piece of knowledge he had accumulated about who Marcus actually was, from the beginning to this moment, and he felt the full weight of it. Not the anger, not now, but something colder and more settled than anger. Clarity. He took off his glasses. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Marcus knew in the first 3 seconds. He knew because of the way Elias stood. Because of the way he looked at him without the glasses. The eyes, which were differently shaped now, but which had the same specific quality of comprehensive attention that had always been, for anyone paying the right kind of attention, Theodore Ashford's most distinctive feature. Because of the tone of voice, stripped now of the employee's careful neutrality, coming out of this new face with all of its old precision. Marcus sat down. He sat for a long moment with his hands on his knees. "Yes," said Theodore. The name settled the room. Not Elias. Theodore. Said in his own voice, the voice that Marcus had known for 20 years, out of a face Marcus had never expected to see again. "How?" said Marcus. Marcus looked at him for a very long time. His expression moved through several things: shock, and then calculation, and then something that might, in a different kind of man, have been the beginning of shame, but which in Marcus was only the adaptation of a man who has realized the position has changed and is looking for the new angle. Theodore watched all of this happen. Marcus said nothing. He paused. Marcus looked at him. He looked for the crack. The forgiving thing, the thing that had always been there in Theodore, the space through which Marcus had operated for 20 years. He found something different. Not hardness, Theodore had never been hard, but a settled, final quality of resolution that was more absolute than hardness. Marcus stood. He straightened his jacket. He crossed to the door, and Theodore moved aside. At the door, Marcus paused. Marcus left the manor. He would not be back. Chapter 27, Celeste. She found out that evening. Celeste stood in the kitchen and looked at all of it, at Mrs. Briggs's tears, at Joseph's relief, at Amara's expression, and the pieces came together with the quiet, terrible logic of things that, once seen, cannot be unseen. She had been looking at Elias Vance for 4 months with the specific quality of attention that had first been trained on Theodore Ashford. The thing she kept almost catching, the reflection at the edge of the mirror. She understood. She sat down in a chair and understood it fully and sat with what that meant. Not just that he was alive, which was its own enormous fact, but that he had come back here, had been here for 4 months, had sat across from her every morning in the kitchen and read her and known her and been present with her, while knowing everything she had done. While knowing everything, and had looked at her the way he looked at her anyway. She found him in the East Wing library. He was standing at the window with his back to the door, and he heard her come in, and he turned. He was not Elias Vance anymore, or the face was still what the surgery and the years had made it, but the way he held himself was different. The way he looked at her was different. There was no performance now, nothing between them but what they were. She stopped in the middle of the room. She stood very still. She was not performing anything. She was, for the first time in his knowledge of her, completely unguarded, and what was there under the guard was not simple, and was not easy to look at. Grief and fury and a desperate, aching, overwhelmed relief that she had not yet sorted into anything manageable. She stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. And she saw it without the layers now, without the management and the new face and the careful distance of 4 months. Saw what had always been there in the quality of his attention, which was the specific and unreasonable and absolute attention of a man who loves someone not despite what he knows about them, but because of the full and complete truth of who they are, complicated and imperfect and real. She stood in the middle of the library and felt the full weight of the last 4 years press through her. Everything she had done and everything she had refused and everything she had stayed for and everything she had lost and everything, impossibly, that was standing in front of her now. She looked at him for a very long time. He was very still. They stood there in the library in the evening light with all of it between them, the full, terrible, real, unrepeatable complexity of what had happened and what remained. And he took 1 step toward her, and she held her ground and looked at him, and neither of them moved for a moment that stretched and held, and then simply was. 2 people standing in the truth of a thing, which is sometimes, if you are very brave or very tired of being anything other than honest, the place where the next part begins. Chapter 28, Elliot Knows. He was sitting at the piano when Theodore came to find him. Not playing, sitting. With his hands in his lap and his feet not quite reaching the floor and his face arranged in the patient, absorbed expression he had when he was thinking about something difficult. Theodore stood in the doorway. He had been standing in doorways a great deal lately. He went in. He sat on the bench beside his son. They sat together in the silence that had always been their particular kind of silence. Not absence but presence. The silence of 2 people who are comfortable enough to be in the same air without needing to fill it. Theodore said nothing. "I know," said Theodore. Theodore looked at his son. At the ears which finally, at 8 years old, fit his face. At the gap in the teeth, long resolved. At the hands in his lap, which were bigger than they used to be, but which had the same quality. Careful, attentive, prepared to hold something. Elliot thought about this with great seriousness. "You were keeping us safe," Elliot said. It was not quite a question. It was the child's understanding, arrived at by a route he had traveled alone. "Yes," said Theodore. Elliot nodded. He looked at his hands for another moment. He looked at Theodore. "You look different," he said. Theodore looked at his son and felt something in his chest that had no name, but that was the precise interior feeling of a man who has come home after a long time away and found that what he left is still there. Not unchanged, grown, deepened, widened, but there. Still there. Can I call you Papa now? Elliot asked. He put his hands on the keys. He played. Theodore sat beside him on the piano bench and listened to his son play the cello sonata in E minor, imperfectly and with great feeling, and outside the window the fountain was working, and the late summer light was doing something particular to the old oak trees on the south lawn, and in the kitchen Mrs. Briggs was preparing dinner with the specific energy of a woman who has decided that this occasion warrants an extraordinary meal. And he was home. Chapter 29. What is rebuilt? There are things that cannot be restored. This is the truth that sits at the center of every return story, the gravity around which everything else orbits. You cannot go back. The fire happened. The years happened. The choices were made. The person who made them is responsible for them and cannot unmake them. Theodore knew this. He had known it in the hospital, and in the apartment in the foreign city, and in the gym at 4 in the morning, and in the operating theater, and in the months of recovery, and in the careful years of rebuilding. You do not go back. You go forward, which requires that you take the past with you, which is heavier than anyone warns you. He took it with him. What was rebuilt was not the same as what had been. How could it be? It was better in some ways. His understanding of himself had been clarified by everything that had happened in the way that fire clarifies what burns and what endures. He knew what he was made of. He had tested it. It was worse in other ways, too. He was not going to pretend otherwise, not even to himself. There were nights when the scar tissue reminded him. There were moments when he looked at Elliot and felt the weight of what he had put his son through, the years of a child's grief, and he could not find a way to make that light. He held it all. He had learned to hold it all. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. He told the household formally, in the second week of September. He gathered them in the kitchen, Mrs. Briggs and Joseph and Amara and Felix and Samuel and George and Priya and Rosario and the brothers and everyone who had been part of this extended, improbable, beloved community, and he told them who he was. He had expected shock. I came back, he said. She nodded. She let go of his hands and went back to her place, and the kitchen was full of people deciding how to be in the aftermath of that. Samuel, said George. Theodore laughed. He had not laughed, genuinely, freely, in the way of a person who is entirely present in a moment, for a very long time. The kitchen laughed with him. Chapter 30. The Long Conversation. He and Celeste had a great many conversations in the months that followed. Not easy conversations. They were not that kind of people, and what was between them was not that kind of thing. They were the kind of conversations that required sitting with what was true, and what was complicated, and what was still unresolved without reaching for easy resolutions, which is the hardest kind of conversation to have, and the only kind that builds anything worth having. She told him everything. Not in one sitting but over weeks, in the early mornings in the kitchen, and in the evenings in the library, and once, in a long walk through the restored grounds in October, when the light was going and the leaves were turning and neither of them was in a hurry. She told him about Marcus and how she had come to be part of the plan, and about the debt and the fear and the specific desperation that she had used to justify what she did. She told him about the moment in the study when Marcus had spoken, and she had understood that she had agreed to something she had not fully understood. She told him about the 3 years, about staying, about what had changed in her. He listened the way he had always listened, without performing patience, without letting her off too easily, with the questions that came from someone who was trying to understand rather than to judge, which is a different quality of question and harder to receive, because it requires you to be honest in return. He told her things too, about the 3 years, about what it had done to him, the anger and the grief and the long process of deciding what he wanted to carry forward and what he needed to put down, about the fear that no one had ever loved him for who he was, which was the oldest wound, the one from before Marcus, before Celeste, the wound that had made him vulnerable to both of them. She listened. He looked at her. She held this. She did not look away. He thought about it honestly, in the way he tried to think about everything important. She looked at him for a long time. Me too, she said. They sat in the kitchen in the October morning light. It was not an ending. It was not a resolution in the tidy sense. It was two people, having arrived at the hardest version of honesty they had ever managed, sitting together in it, which is, for certain kinds of love, not the conclusion but the real beginning, the place where the foundation is finally solid enough to build on. Chapter 31. The Fountain. November came, and with it the anniversary. He spent the morning of the 14th with Elliot, as he spent most mornings, breakfast, and then the south garden, and then the natural history books that Elliot was currently annotating in the margins in the manner of a small but serious scholar. It was, in every observable way, an ordinary morning, and the ordinariness of it was something Theodore had trained himself to receive as the extraordinary thing it was. He walked the grounds in the afternoon alone. He walked past the restored east wing, past the north garden with its repaired wall, past the old oak tree on the south lawn that had lost a branch when he was a boy, and that had grown so fully around the scar that you could no longer see where the branch had been. He walked to the fountain. He stood at the fountain. He had bought it because it reminded him of a photograph of Rome. He had never been to Rome. He had bought it and forgotten to have it repaired for 3 years, and then it had worked, and then he had died and come back, and it was still working, the water moving in the same patient circle it had always described. He thought, I will go to Rome. He and Elliot and, if she wanted, Celeste. They would go and see the fountain he had seen in the photograph, and it would be entirely different from the photograph and better for being real. He heard footsteps on the gravel. Celeste came to stand beside him. She did not take his hand. They were still in the place of careful, real, unhurried, but she stood beside him in the way of someone who has decided to be present without requiring anything of the moment. They looked at the fountain. He listened. Yes, he said. He thought about this honestly. She looked at him. The fountain moved. The afternoon light was doing what November light does, going golden and then going, and all the world in the interim lit in a way that made you want to stay in it. Theo, she said. His name. The real one, out of her voice, for the first time since the library. He looked at her. He stood at his fountain in November light. He stood with all the weight of it, all the harm, all the grief, all the love that had never stopped, all the hope that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, survived. He said it the way he had said it on the night he proposed, in the lamplight of the study with the books on the floor. Simply. Directly. The way of a man who means exactly what he says, and is not in the habit of saying things he doesn't. She looked at him, and her eyes were bright, and the current was there beneath the surface and above it. Finally, the warmth was not performing itself, but simply was. She laughed. He heard it, the real laugh, the one from the Caldwell dinner, the one that had first made him stay. Full and genuine and unstoppable. Here, in the November light, at his fountain in his home. The laugh that had always been the one he wanted to hear for the rest of his life. Epilogue. What Elliot drew. 1 year later. Elliot was 9 now, and the years fit entirely, and he had developed, in the past year, a new drawing practice that he conducted at the kitchen table after breakfast when the morning was still early, and the house had the particular quality of inhabited quiet. He drew with a focus that excluded all distraction, Mrs. Briggs moving around him, George's football argument conducting itself at low volume in the corridor, the sound of the fountain through the open kitchen window. He was drawing the house. Theodore sat across from him with his coffee and his newspaper, which he read in the way of a man who reads newspapers out of principle even when the world had long since moved its news elsewhere, and he watched his son draw. The house took shape on the paper in Elliot's deliberate lines. 3 stories, the fountain in the drive, detailed, accurate, including the small imperfection in the base that had been there since the original installation, the ivy on the east wing, the old oaks on the south lawn. Then the figures. He drew them small, outside the house. A group of people. He labeled them in his neat, growing handwriting. MRSB, Joseph, Amara, Felix, Samuel and George, Priya and others, all the people of the extended household. He drew one figure by itself at the fountain. He labeled it Papa. He drew a figure beside it. He labeled it Mama. He drew a small figure between them. He labeled it Me. He considered the drawing for a moment. Then he drew something else, a line from the fountain to the house, with small marks along it like footsteps, and at the far end of the line, where it reached the door, he wrote in his careful hand a single word. He pushed the drawing across the table. Theodore looked at it. He looked at the fountain and the family and the house and the footsteps leading home. He looked at the word Elliot had written at the end. Home. He put down his newspaper. He picked up his son's drawing. He held it for a long time. She sat down. She looked at the drawing. She put her hand briefly on Elliot's shoulder, which was her way. Theodore looked at her over the paper. She looked back. Outside, the fountain moved in its patient circle. Joseph was in the garden. Mrs. Briggs was preparing something that smelled of everything right. In the corridor, Samuel and George had arrived at the point in their argument where they were both laughing. Theodore Ashford, who had been a man no one wanted, and then a man everyone believed dead, and then a new man, and then finally, most laboriously and most completely himself, set down his son's drawing on the kitchen table. He reached across and poured Celeste a coffee. She accepted it. The morning continued.